How and why did God create us? God created us male and female in His own image to know Him, love Him, live with Him, and glorify Him. And it's right that we who were created by God should live to His glory. In this fourth question, the Catechism explores what it means to be human. What distinguishes us from all other creatures and beings? What marks us out as a specific species, a specific design in God's deep and loving will? The Catechism turns to a biblical term, the image of God, to explore this distinction. Genesis 1 tells us that on the sixth day of creation, after God had made the air, the land, and the sea, the things above and the things below, the very heavens and earth, God made the man and the woman in His image. In the likeness of God, He made them. This has been a much debated term throughout history, with many theologians pointing to different facets of the human or different activities of human life as constituting the image. Some see our thinking, our rationality, or intellect as that which brings us closest to God, suggesting that's the image. Others have seen that we are relational beings, and like the triune God who lives in love, we too can love and enjoy life and sociality, relationships with others. Perhaps that's the image. Still others point to the task given to humans in Genesis 1, that we're called to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue and have dominion over the earth. We're to serve as God's ambassadors or vice-regents, governing the world on His behalf and in His stead. Perhaps that's the image. And yet, as we read Genesis 1, we find a broader point being made. That we're made in the image of God says something profound about God and something profound about us. Not about a part of us, but about our totality. That God makes an image, first of all, tells us that God is an imaging God. That God is a God who desires to be known, to make Himself known, to show His glory. God desires to spread His goodness. God does not desire simply to enjoy eternity, Father, Son, and Spirit, though God was infinitely happy, infinitely satisfied, infinitely joyful in Himself. Though God was self-sufficient, God nonetheless desired to spread forth His glory, to share that joy with someone else, to make an image. And so creation itself shows us something of God's heart, something of God's passion to make Himself known, to display Himself, and ultimately to live with another. The image of God, first and foremost, tells us something profound about the God of the Bible. Secondly, though, the image of God tells us something profound about the human, and perhaps we see this best by contrasting it with the way we often think about ourselves. You perhaps have heard the story of the CEO and his wife who left the big city and went out to the rural community where she'd grown up. It was her 25th reunion, and she was the guest speaker, the celebrity alum of her high school class. They flew in on the private jet, they rented the Rolls Royce and drove to the high school, and as they were returning, they had to stop at a gas station. The CEO got out, and as he spoke to the gas station attendant, they discovered that this was the wife's ex-boyfriend from high school. They said their greetings, they caught up on old history, and then the CEO and his wife left town. And as they drove off, the husband snickered. The wife said, "Why are you laughing?" And he said, "You ought to be glad you married me and not that man." At which point the wife laughed. And the husband, not in on the joke, asked, "Why are you laughing at that?" She said, "I was just thinking about how if I'd married him, he'd be a CEO and you'd be a gas station attendant." The story points to the fact that each of us believes we're defined by what we do, that we are the shapers of ourselves, that we make ourselves or we break ourselves, that it's up to us to fashion our identity, to prove our worth, to get somewhere. And yet the Bible begins in a very different place. The first thing said of the human is that he or she is the image of God. First and foremost, we're defined not by what's in us, but by what is outside of us. So theologian David Kelsey has spoken of what he calls our eccentric existence, that we're defined by that which is outside of us and which completes us, which satisfies us. We are an image of God. Think of the mirror that you saw this morning as you got out of bed. You went into the bathroom, you looked at it, and the mirror displayed your picture to you. It showed you that gruesome picture, bags under the eyes, tousled hair, tired face. It accurately portrayed that which was before it. And yet the first thing we've got to say about a mirror before anything else is that it's not you. It portrays you, it accurately conveys your image, but no one will go and hug or kiss, slap or berate the mirror, thinking it to be you. A mirror is a tool or an instrument that conveys some truth about yourself to the world. The first and primary thing we must understand about the human is that we're not God. We're not divine, we're not eternal, we're not self-sufficient, we're not creators, we're not makers. Ultimately, we are dependent beings. We live at the behest of another. We live on borrowed breath. We live dependent. We see this day by day as we constantly have to return to the table for nourishment. And even more regularly as we constantly have to depend upon oxygen for our very physical existence. Just as much as our physical bodies depend on something outside of themselves to live, so we depend spiritually upon that which must satisfy us. We are but images. You know what, though? Genesis 1 celebrates that dependence. While we might look at that kind of existence and view it as some sort of manic dependency, some sort of inferior existence, some sort of condition that ought to be treated, that ought to be dealt with, that ought to be improved, the Bible says that we were made to be God's image, that we were made to be dependent beings, and that God called it very good. God celebrates our finitude and our limitedness. God celebrates the fact that we are human and not divine. God calls it very good. God is not embarrassed by our neediness or our dependence. We should not be either. In fact, the Catechism, in its fourth answer, says that we ought to embrace this. We ought to know God and love God. We ought to live with Him and thus to glorify Him. It is right that those who are created by Him should live lives that give Him glory by turning to Him as the one we image, by looking to Him as the one who satisfies our deepest needs. As we embrace our finitude, as we look outward for our satisfaction, as we entrust ourselves to God, we image Him well. But on those occasions where we cease to embrace our finitude, where we insist on being as gods, where we seek to live as though we were self-sufficient, we portray to a watching world a deep-seated suspicion that God is not enough, that He's incapable or disinterested in doing us good. We image poorly. We tell the world what we think of God, but we don't image accurately the God of the gospel, the God who's generous and almighty, the God who's merciful and eternal, the God who is so steadfast in the face of our sin, and yet who's infinite. And so the Bible tells the story of images, pure images in Eden, the image that's broken and distorted by sin, the image that's perfected in Jesus Christ, and that ultimately we shall share in glory. That's what it means to be created, to lead lives dependently, to live a life that is eccentric, centered outside of ourselves, turning to another for satisfaction. That's what it means to be the image of God. That's what it means to give God glory.